Good evening. Welcome to Insights, Newcastle University's Public Lectures programme. My name is Martin Farr. I'm co-chair of the Public Lectures Committee. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you this evening to our penultimate public lecture of the semester. I normally say these things standing up, so it's quite nice to have the luxury of an armchair as we have an in conversation this evening. But the same things apply. Please would you ensure your phones are in a silent mode. I hope the echo I think I hear isn't too distracting. If it is, please wave. And if we're not expecting a fire drill, if you hear a fire alarm, please join us in the car park afterwards. I'm also here as a senior lecturer in contemporary British history, and that's why Chris Mullin is such an important person to speak to and to listen to and indeed to read. And the fact that you're all here is evidence that an introduction isn't really required, but I'll just point out some of the key moments in his career so that you know. He was originally a journalist, and instead is a journalist and a writer. Editor of Tribune, the Labour Party newspaper, Labour MP for Sunderland South between 1987 and 2010, a minister in Tony Blair's government between 1999 and 2005 at the Departments of Environment, International Development, and the Foreign and Commonwealth Office. And it's a question we could ask later, a chairman of one of the House of Commons select committees in Home Affairs Select Committee, a very prominent select committee, and also a member of the Standards and Privileges Committee in the House of Commons. But most prestigiously of all, a lecturer at Newcastle University since 2010 in the Department of Politics. And throughout the talk, I'm doing a very relaxed fashion. We're going to have the first half in sort of conversation, and then halfway through the lights will come up and we can open to a much broader conversation. But I'll pitch our conversation through the diaries, and I perhaps should mention that the diaries will be on sale afterwards. There'll be a book signing. The hardback will be £20, cash and card, and the paperbacks will be a mere £10. I want to start with this quotation. 30th September 2014. You write, "These days one has to be a celebrity chef or a TV comedian to sell non-fiction."
Yeah, well, I'm neither of those.
But I look out at our largest audience for at least 3 years and realise that can't possibly be true.
Well, somebody did say to me at one of the festivals I went to that although they have famous authors there, writers of fiction there, it's the political meetings that attract the most, the political books that attract the most, the biggest audiences at festivals. I think that is because the political meeting actually is not dead. It's just transferred to the literary festival, or in this case to the university.
It does seem an amazingly fecund subject. I mean, there are so many festivals you attend in this volume.
I've done about 200 since I retired.
You'll get the hang of them, yes. Page 20th of December 2013. To a church in Harrow to take part in any questions. One has to make the most of such invitations since there won't be many more.
Well, you see,
how's that going?
When I retired, if you've read the previous volume of Diaries, Decline and Fall, you'll see there was a great deal of agonising about whether it was a good idea to retire or not. And I knew there was a life outside politics, of course, but I wasn't certain there was any life for me outside of politics. And I actually stopped keeping a diary for a period. But then it rapidly became clear that there was a life outside politics for me. And so I started again. It's not just about politics. Two remarkable things happened within 2 months of my retiring. I lived in the centre of Sunderland for 25 years. And I'd always hankered after a walled garden in Northumberland, and we had spent a lot of time. Look, there's lots of derelict walled gardens in Northumberland and the borders, and we looked at quite a few. Mostly they were vetoed by my wife on the grounds they were too remote or that they were too expensive. But then we were up at a place called Callerley in the north of Northumberland, and I noticed there was an old couple who lived in one of the walled garden cottages, whose name was, it'll come back to me, Elphinstone. And there was a woman who taught at a school in Sunderland whose surname was Elphinstone, which is not a very common name. So I said, if they ever want to sell, let me know. And 5 years went by, and literally 2 months after I retired, she left a message on my answer phone which said, "They're both dead, are you still interested?" So I got up there quickly, and without the intervention of an estate agent, or indeed a surveyor, bought it. And I wouldn't have been able to afford to do that, but for a second stroke of luck that occurred also around the same time. And that was that a film company bought the rights on my first novel, A Very British Coup, for the second time. And that was a major contribution to the cost of the walled garden in Northumberland, which is where I intend to be carried out of in due course, but not immediately, I hope.
You use the word retired, but you've returned to your original calling. Do you feel that you've retired?
Well, I'm quite busy. I think if you read that, you'll see there's
yes.
quite a lot going on.
Yes, indeed, yes.
I probably stretch the elastic about as far as it will go now. The first thing that happened, I was asked to be a judge of the Booker Prize, which was very good fun. Although there came a moment when, because I think, how many books did we have to read? 140 or 150. And I came to dread the sight of the postman coming up the garden path with another great... but it was very enjoyable. And then somebody suggested to me that I should apply to the Heritage Lottery Fund. They were looking for a chairman at the northern region of the northeast region of the Heritage Lottery Fund. So I applied for that, and I got it. So I had 6 wonderful years as chairman of the... The thing about the Heritage Lottery Fund is that everybody's glad to see you when you come from... It's not like that when you're an MP, you know. Certainly not in Sunderland. You only get called in when there's trouble. But of course, for the lottery, everybody was very glad to see you. So I had 6 very good years doing that. In between all these festivals and other things. The other thing that happened, of course, was that a small industry developed around the Diaries. This is the 4th volume. There were 3 previous ones.
I was going to mention that, yes, the titles.
I really spent the first few years just servicing the industry. It was wonderful fun because everybody's very nice to you at literary festivals. Again, they're glad to see you. I've done festivals all the way from Lerwick in the Shetlands to Foy in Cornwall and many in between. And I thoroughly enjoy it.
These diaries, the titles of the volumes are, in order, A View from the Foothills, A Walk on Part, Decline and Fall, and Didn't You Used to Be Chris Mullin? This is almost a monument to self-effacement. All 2,000 pages of it. Where does the title for this edition come from?
Well, I was strolling around the House of Commons a couple of years after I retired, and a former colleague came up to me, and he looked at me over the top of his glasses like this, and he said, "Didn't you used to be Chris Mullin?" So I said, "Thank you, that'll do for the title of Volume 4.
Do you feel the diaries will be your most significant imprint on? I mean, they're used so widely, they're reprinted so often, they're discussed so frequently.
A significant imprint on what?
I mean, Alan Clark's, for example, have become literary landmarks. I mean, yours have in a similar way.
Yeah, it's not for me to judge. I think certainly the 2 of the 3 earlier volumes were very successful. The first one was reprinted 14 times, I think.
Yes.
But I'm a fading force now, you know. So who knows what this one will be.
I was going to mention the episode when you meet a mildly hostile journalist who gave you a bad review of the volume, and you pointed out with great pleasure that it had been reprinted 14 times.
I'm rather proud of that. It was at the Durham Literary Festival a few years ago. And I met a woman, her name was Rachel Cook. She's quite a well-known author, I think. And after I'd been sitting chatting to her in the green room for a while, I realised that she was the author of almost the only unkind thing ever said about the first volume of the Diaries. I'll tell you what she said. I only knew about it because I happened to be in London and bought an Evening Standard, and it was just one line in a little diary column that she'd written. And she'd said, and she was referring to A View from the Foothills, the first one, "I don't think he realises what a Berkey is." So I didn't let on that I knew about this. But she then inquired about the diaries. That was the point at which I realised who she was. And I did take a great deal of pleasure in saying it was on its 14th reprint. And what I'm particularly proud of is that I never let on that I'd read that quote in the Evening Standard.
Robert Shrimsley in the FT reviewed your memoir Hinterland, which is a bit like William Waldegrave's. It's one of the slimmer, better written political memoirs rather than these tombstones that recount people's achievements. And he said in his FT review, reading your diaries, he said, left me to regret that in my decade as a political reporter, I had lazily bought into the stereotype of Mullin as a Bennite headbanger and never got to know him.
Well, he's interviewed me a couple of times since then, and I think he probably has revised his opinion now.
But there is a nuance to your positions on many things that wouldn't be an assumption of a person from the left.
Of course, yes. Yeah.
On Europe or on Corbyn.
On all sorts of things. I mean, there's always two sides to an argument. The other thing, I mean, if you look on the inside cover, down the bottom there, that woman from the Sunday Times.
Jenny Russell, what
does she say?
Thank you for that. One of Mullin's charms is his readiness to like people who don't echo his politics.
Yes, that's right. Yes, exactly. So I get on with all sorts of unlikely people from dukes to dustmen. That's if you're a politician, you have to do that anyway. But I've come across more dukes since I retired than I ever did when I was in Parliament. I must say, there's a wonderful chap called the Duke of Buccleuch, who's the country's greatest landowner. He's Europe's largest landowner, 275,000 acres. And he's a sponsor of the Melrose Festival, which is one of my favourite ones. And I saw him at the back of my talk once. And then afterwards, I saw him wandering around the grounds of Harmony Hall, the house where the festival is held. And he was carrying one copy of my book and 4 copies of a book by Carol Klein, the Gardener's World lady. And I said, why have you got 4? He said, 1 for each of my head gardeners. There's one other person, I think, one other person who's somewhat removed from my world that you'll find features in there quite a lot. So Humphrey Wakefield, Chillingham Castle. Some of you may have been to Chillingham Castle. Wonderful little air pocket of tranquility in the midst of nowhere. The Mullin family, he rents apartments in the castle. And the Mullin family used to, we used to rent one of his apartments at usually the Whitsun holiday. And the third time we stayed there, this is in the mid-1990s, when my children were young, third time we stayed there, he recognised me and he said, "What's a socialist doing staying at a place like this?" So I said, well, I thought my money was probably as good as anybody else's. He said, "These apartments are awfully underpriced." And the next year they went up by about 50%, thereby putting the Mullins out. But actually I've got on very well with him since. We have a number of interests in common, not least the Chillingham wild cattle. I'm a trustee of the white cattle. And every so often I get invited to dinner there. I did. I mean, I don't think he does them, but he's quite old now. I don't think he does them very often. But he had these big dinners with about 20 or so. They were all sort of aged aristos of the 35th Earl of this and that, you know, not the sort of people I have a lot in common with. But every so often, you came across somebody really interesting. And I sat next to this wonderful woman once, and halfway through dinner, she said, of course, she said this apropos of nothing, of course, Attlee's big mistake was not to nationalise the public schools. I said, hang on a minute. This is not a sentiment one hears around this table very often. And I looked to see whether the chandelier was swaying, and it was slightly. And then someone remarked on the gown she was wearing. She was wearing a very nice gown. And she said, yes, I had to get it for the film, she said, for the film premiere. So my ears cocked up at this. I said, what film? Oh, they made a film, she said. I said, what about? My Life, she said. Oh. Turned out, it's a wonderful film. You may have seen it. It's been on TV recently, called Breathe. She married a young army officer in Kenya in the 1950s, and they had one child. And then he went down with polio very severely. And as you know, in those days, people severely afflicted by polio ended up in machines, in hospitals, and never left. And she insisted on taking him home. And the doctors resisted totally, really fought to stop her. And they said, oh, he'll be dead within 3 months if you do that. Well, she insisted on taking him out. A friend of theirs rigged up an old Bedford van with oxygen and so forth, and they started touring Europe, campaigning for better treatment of polio victims, and he lived for another 34 years. It's a wonderful story. So, yeah, anyway, yes, Diana Peel, all Humphrey's friends are related to famous people, and she's a direct descendant of Sir Robert Peel, the Victorian Prime Minister.
And Andrew Mitchell, I hadn't realised how friendly you were with.
Oh, yes.
Andrew
Yeah,
Mitchell.
I have a few friends in high places still, not many. He's in the Foreign Office now. He's a good man. He's a One Nation Tory. I like One Nation Tories. And as you know, he was framed actually by those policemen on the gate at Downing Street. But he wasn't a fan of Boris, and as you'll see in there. And he said to me, not so long ago actually, he said, Boris is like a James Bond villain who, just when everything's falling apart, this was around the time that Boris was in trouble, climbs into his fireproof module, stroking his white cat, and sails away into the stratosphere, leaving everybody else to clear up afterwards. So I put that in my diary, of course, and then I thought, when I was editing it, I thought, well, I better check this. Andrew's still in the government. I don't want to get him into trouble. So I sent it to him and said, do you mind if I include this? And do you want your name attached to it? He said, oh, yes, go ahead. And so there it is. You'll
The years covered in this volume, they include the Leveson inquiry into press intrusion, Margaret Thatcher's death, the Scottish referendum, Jo Cox's murder, the Brexit referendum, Donald Trump, the extraordinary 2017 general election, Boris Johnson, as you mentioned, the extraordinary 2019 general election, a global pandemic, and the death of the Queen. Now, one can be guilty of recency bias in assuming that things have been more febrile in recent years than in the past, but that does seem an unusually dense period of uncertainty and worry. Is that the case, or is it merely our recollection is still so recent?
No, I think it is the case. This ends with the death of the Queen. I was always on the lookout for a way of ending it because it covers 12 years, and that was quite enough.
Good effect, yes.
And I thought, well, maybe the fall of Boris Johnson, which seemed to me inevitable, but then it didn't quite cut it. But then I knew that as soon as the Queen died, that's the cut-off point, it's the end of an era. Somebody tweeted, because I mean, one thing we didn't say there, there's been quite a turnover. There's always a bit of a turnover in politics, but it's been a hell of a turnover under this strong and stable government that Theresa May promised us.
3 years sometimes.
Yes. Well, yes. Somebody tweeted, must have been in the autumn of last year, said, my son has lived through 2 prime ministers, 2 monarchs, 3 chancellors, 4 foreign secretaries, and however many home secretaries. He is 4 months old. And I saw some figures the other day. I mean, in this government, the whole 12 years of this government, or 13 years, or whatever it is, there's been about 5 prime ministers, 8 chancellors, 7 foreign secretaries. I may have that the wrong way round. There's been 10 education secretaries, 12 culture secretaries. One of them, Nadine Dorries. That's extraordinary turnover. One of the big problems of British politics, I should say, this was a problem in the Blair government too, was the amount of reshuffling. They got into the habit of annual reshuffles, which you really don't need if you've got competent people. You should leave them where they are, not keep messing about. But they always like to start throwing all the pieces into the air and seeing where they land. I mean, of course, this lot's had no choice in recent years because crisis has dictated. And there's always, if you're Prime Minister, there's always crisis. There's people having to resign for one reason or another. I understand that. But, I mean, in the Blair government, for example, I was the 6th Africa minister. We had 9 in 13 years. Well, you're dealing with sophisticated foreigners if you're a Foreign Office minister, and they've been in place for a long time, and they know their briefs inside out. And I remember a big African the president, I think, came through my office, came through the Foreign Office once, and he said to me, he'd been 4 times to London, he'd never met the same minister twice. It's just embarrassing. And we had, Labour, this is I'm talking about, had 13 Europe ministers. That's counting Jeff Hoon, who came round twice, once for 4 months. 4 months? I remember when the election took place, as well, another thing is that really you want to put round pegs in round holes if you can. And in 1997, my friend Joyce Quinn, who was an MP for Gateshead, a lovely woman, she'd been our Europe spokesman, and she was ideally qualified. She spoke several European languages. She'd done the brief in opposition for the last 3 or 4 years. Obviously, she was going to be the Europe minister as soon as we won the election. She rang me up the day after the election. She said, "I've just been made Minister of Prisons. What am I going to do? I've never set foot in a prison before." And then Doug Henderson, who'd been a defence spokesman, suddenly found he was the Europe minister. And by the Saturday, the election result having been declared overnight on Thursday, Friday, by the Saturday, he was on a plane to Brussels to negotiate with, as I say, these sophisticated foreigners who really didn't know what they were talking about. Of course, it all went badly wrong, and they had to put Joyce back eventually, and she did. She lasted a couple of years, I think, in that post, and then they made her an agriculture minister. There's not a lot of agriculture in Gateshead.
Did you ever ask the man, as you referred to Tony Blair, why he was keen on such ministerial churn?
Oh, yes, I did. Well, after he got rid of me, actually, we had a chat, and I cited some of those figures that I've just cited to him, and he sort of smiled nervously and said, "We don't do this very well, do we?" And I said, "Who's we?"
So how much do you put down to the instability of these last few years to what you describe in the book as a reckless game of brinkmanship for the sole purpose of papering over divisions in the Conservative Party, i.e. Brexit?
Brexit. Yeah, well, of course, Brexit is what's changed the nature of British politics. I mean, it really has made a hell of a difference to the whole. And we've seen the rise of English nationalism. This talk was originally scheduled for 2 years ago. It's been cancelled twice, once because of COVID and once because of the strike. And my original title was The Rise of English Nationalism, which I think is an interesting phenomena. But Brexit really has poisoned, I would say, the British politics. It's also done great damage to the economy. They keep going on, the present management keep going on about the need for growth, but they've just cheered 4% off GDP with Brexit. I've noticed over the years, incidentally, that there's 3 types of Brexiteers. And some of you may be Brexiteers. There's 3 types of Brexiteers. There's the working classes. I'm generalising here and oversimplifying, so forgive me. The working classes who, on the whole, were worried about migration, and I think the metropolitan elite, and there is such a thing as a metropolitan elite, never really understood how much of a worry that was for a lot of people, what a concern that it was. And then the Tory MPs, on the whole, were obsessed with deregulation and a bonfire of the regulations, which they've been promising would happen as soon as Brexit was out the way. Well, it is out the way, and there hasn't been a bonfire of regulations. They're finding it a bit more complicated than they thought. And then there's the rather grander Brexiteers, and I've got lots of them living around me up in the north of Northumberland. They're what I call the We Want Our Country Back brigade. And the thing I notice about them is they all earn more than their fair share of the country already.
With Brexit, one thing that comes across in the Diaries very clearly is your frustration initially that there's so little steer from the Labour Party as to its position on the EU. And you have, I think, a very empathetic view of Corbyn's leadership of the party. But is it possible to think that a more activist Labour leader would have made a difference to the outcome?
Yes, I think so. You say I have an empathetic view of Corbyn. No, I'm not a Corbynista.
No, indeed. But
I like him as a human being,
yes.
And I think he's been disgracefully treated. I've known him for 40 years. He's a very decent guy, and I deprecate the way in which he's been treated, both by the Labour Party leadership and, of course, by our free press. But yes, the thing about Jeremy is he was wholly unsuited to be Prime Minister. And he's never really changed his mind on anything in the last 40 years. And one of them, of course, is Europe. So he didn't really put his back into, and had he done so, I mean, there's only a couple of percent in it, it might have made a difference. Certainly if it had someone of the stature of Blair or somebody in charge, it might have done.
You say there's a very nice line, or you're repeating a line someone mentions to you in 2015. The next Labour Prime Minister may still be in primary school.
Yes.
Is that still the case, do you think?
No, I don't. The one thing you will learn from reading my diaries, it goes for all 4 volumes, is that I'm a pessimist. I always err on the side of pessimism. I get quite a lot of things right, but I get some things wrong as well. There certainly was a period, certainly after the 2019 election, where I thought we might not see another Labour government in my lifetime. But I'm glad to say I think it likely that we will now. And it won't be very brave, but then they've got quite a lot of problems to take on.
Blair, as you know, was forced from office. The moment was really refusing to call it a ceasefire over Israel's assaults in Gaza, in 2006.
Israel's last assault.
Yes. And Starmer and ceasefire have also had an awkward relationship in the last month or so. How has he handled the situation, you feel?
Not well. I mean, I think he's been captured by the Israel lobby. I know this is very controversial, and some of you will disagree with me. But no, I think what's happening is awful. I think the terrible act of terrorism that started all this, let me be clear about that. But I don't think killing 15,000 people, which they've killed so far, and they're going to start again in 2 days' time. And look, all those beautiful little children. I can hardly bear to, I don't know about you, I can hardly bear to turn on the news and look at it. I think it's awful, and I think we should have more to say about it. In fairness, the Israelis don't care at all about what we think. They care only about what the Americans think.
In 2018, you write, "It never ceases to disappoint me that so many people of Jewish origin, who on most issues tend to be liberal and left of centre, have a complete blind spot when it comes to Israel. Increasingly, it seems many conflate criticism of Israel with anti-Semitism."
Well, I think that's undoubtedly true. In fact, I've seen prominent Israelis, one of whom was a former head of Mossad, and the other of whom had been in Golda Meir's government, I think, saying that they're actually saying in so many words that anti-Semitism, accusations of anti-Semitism, is a card we play, and it's very effective. In both cases, they weren't saying this with approbation. They were saying it's something that we do. The Mossad man said, "I'm rather ashamed of it, actually, but it does work very well." And we thought, I think we've seen a certain amount of that here. I'm very reluctant to get bogged down in anti-Semitism arguments, though, because it's a great toxic sludge. So I look at it from the humanitarian point of view. I thought it absolutely wrong of Hamas, which is a terrorist organisation, to do what it did, and but the problem is never going to be resolved by more killing. It's only going to be resolved when there's some sort of settlement, and that's nowhere in sight, nowhere at all in sight. And the present Israeli government's done everything it can to sabotage talks of a two-state solution. And Gaza is a Bantustan, and there's some very bad people in eastern Jerusalem now who are ethnically cleansing the east of Jerusalem. They've even started on Armenian Christians in the last few days. It's an awful, awful business.
We may return to this, but I wanted to touch on you as a diarist before we have the lights come off and we open the conversation. Did you keep a diary before you were an MP?
No. I started on the night that John Smith died.
94.
Yes, May 1994, because I finished on the day that Gordon Brown walked out of Downing Street. That's when Decline and Fall ends, and I thought that was it, as I said, and I stopped keeping a diary. So it's the rise and the first 3 volumes chart the rise and fall of New Labour from beginning to end, and then I realised that life was still quite interesting, so I started again. That's where this volume comes from.
Well, as a political historian, diaries are absolutely essential sources, and diaries differ in their methods of writing and the methods of editing. So what's your practice? Do you record every day at the end of the week?
No, nowadays, every day. Well, not every day. Sometimes nothing very interesting happens. So if you're raking up the leaves in the garden, there's not a lot to say about it. But yes, if something strikes me, I note it down, and it can always be cut out if it's too boring or too uninteresting in due course. I'm not sure there will. I still do keep a diary. I'm not sure there'll ever be another volume. Though as I said, I think I've stretched the elastic about as far as I can.
But you mentioned raking the leaves and so on. One thing that your diaries share with Alan Clark is an appreciation of nature and conveying nature very well. And reading the book in a kind of 2 or 3 days, one gets a sense of the changing of the seasons, and it's a very nice contrast with often quite unpleasant things that you're recording on a global scale.
Well, I'm very fortunate. I've ended up in a very beautiful place, really one of the most beautiful parts of the country. Some of you will be familiar with the north of Northumberland. And I do have this large garden, which I'm interested in. Which I spend a lot of time working in. And so it gives a certain balance between writing and well, I don't do much politicking, but events. I do a lot of events.
I was very concerned with the red squirrel situation and was very sad.
Well, we're all very concerned about that. When I first moved up there were 3 red squirrels came to our garden every day, and they disappeared 2 or 3 years ago, and they've never come back. Roy Hattersley said once that he destroyed his diaries, and he was concerned about the effect that being a diarist had on people around him, what they said. And this is also sort of Tony Benn when he was in the cabinet. People were reluctant, or they were conscious when they said something, it would be recorded. You mentioned Andrew Mitchell being checked for quotes. Do you think possibly or sense that people you know are cautious in what they say because they know you're a diarist, or do you always check quotations in advance before? Well, certainly with there were 1 or 2 I should have checked in the first volume, which was a walk. Decline and Fall? No, that was not the first volume. A View from the Foothills. Yes, first one, yes. And I regret not doing so. But subsequent to that, I have always checked anything that was a private conversation with the individual concerned. Sometimes, but you'd be surprised how few people want to have their contribution cut out there. Very, very few indeed. Some people try to improve their contribution. And I say, no, we can't do that. But Sir Humphrey's a big one for elaborating. Straight to the index, I imagine they are, when it comes out. No, that's the other thing. Yes, and I noticed this when I was in the House of Commons. Whenever a political book is published, MPs go to the library and they run their finger down the index to see whether they've got a mention. And when Paddy Ashdown wrote his memoir, or whatever it was, he signed a copy for a Lib Dem MP called Don Foster. And, of course, the first thing Don did when he got it home was run his finger down the index to look for Foster. And Paddy had written in the margin, "Hi, Don, I thought you'd look here first." The lights will now go up, and all you need to do is to catch my eye to ask a question or make a comment. Please would you wait until a roving microphone reaches you, and then speak into it more intimately than you expect you need to, so that everyone in the room can hear. You have one at the front here, please, first of all. And do I have one over this side? My inner auctioneer, yes, over there, please, jumped in the orange top. Thank you very much. You first, please, sir. Yes, please, yeah.
Me? Thank you. You've both mentioned ministerial churn, departmental churn. What's the solution?
Not to churn.
Should there be an obligation not to churn?
No. The Prime Minister's got many balls to keep in the air, And as I say, lots of unexpected things happen in politics, and for one reason or another, sometimes it might be some health crisis, or it might be somebody who's really put their foot in it, or that there's a scandal, people have to resign. And then I think if I was Prime Minister, which by some extraordinary oversight I'm not, but if I was Prime Minister, instead of having a maximum reshuffle, I would just have a minimal one. And certainly if I got people in whom I had confidence in some of the main offices, I wouldn't move them round every year. It takes a year to get a grip on a complex brief. And when I was Africa Minister, for example, which was well down the pecking order, but after I'd been there a couple of years, I was useful. I felt I was useful. I could ring up foreign heads of state, and they'd know who they were talking to because I'd met them before. And then the man in Downing Street raises his little finger by that much, and you're gone. It's very destructive of what we used to call joined-up government. It's been much worse in the last 5 or 6 years than I can ever remember, but it was quite bad under Labour.
Thank you. I hope somebody hears that lesson.
What reasons were you given when you were moved on? Or
They never give reasons. I mean, I was lucky. I got on well with him, you know, the main person, even though I came from a different part of the political stratosphere. So he made clear to me that I could go into government any time I wanted, 97 anyway. And I said I wanted to be chairman of the Home Affairs Select Committee, which I thought was far better than being a junior minister, and so it proved. And then after a couple of years at the Home Affairs Committee, I dropped him a note and said, I'm ready to start governing if you've got... and he made me the lowest form of life in the environment, the vast Department of Environment, something of the regions. I did that for 18 months, and then I said, I'd really like... There was a general election came along. Then he rang up and said, would you like to go be Claire Short's deputy in international development? Which I would have been a square peg in a square hole there. I loved Claire. She was an excellent minister, one of our best, and she was left somewhere for 6 years. She really made an impact. But the one thing I rapidly learned is that Claire didn't need a deputy. So come the 2001 election, I asked to be returned to the ranks. So I went back, and I was reappointed chairman of the Home Affairs Select Committee again. So I had another 2 years at that. And then he made me the Africa minister. Now, I'd voted against the Iraq war, and I was the only member of the government at that time who was one of the 139 Labour MPs who voted against the Iraq war. And the whips were very, very upset. And they did everything possible to persuade him to not to appoint me, first of all, and then when I was appointed, to undermine me. And I think they probably got to him in the end.
do you think Iraq is too prominent in his reputation, or a deserved...
I'm afraid to say it's a catastrophe. And it's sadly, because as I say, he was the outstanding Labour leader of my lifetime, and from time to time one hears him on the radio or the telly talking about whatever the problems of the day are, and it's often a level of discussion and intelligence, and I hear other people remark on this, it's way above the present general discourse, but he'll be forever blighted by the fact that he allied us to what I used to say was the worst American president of my lifetime. But of course, George Bush has been Trump since then, hasn't he? So I don't. That's my big quarrel with him, really, that he allied us umbilically to the man who was undoubtedly the worst American president up to that point.
Would you mention your interaction with George W. Bush for the audience?
Oh, yes, okay. This is in a previous volume, but it was when I was at the Foreign Office. George Bush came on a state visit, I think it was. And you know, when the American president comes, a big convoy of vehicles with blacked out windows, and snipers appear on the roof of the Foreign Office. There's a big courtyard in the centre of the Foreign Office, which normally used as a bit of a car park, but all the cars were cleared out of it. And I thought, well, it's not every day that the American president comes to my place of work, so I'll go and watch because George was due to give his last press conference in the Carno room in the Foreign Office, and he was having breakfast with Blair first and then walking through from Downing Street. So I went and planted myself on the far side of the courtyard, and it was completely empty, except for a man with an earpiece who was clearly being told by someone on the roof to get that civilian inside. And I pulled rank and said, no, I'm a minister, I'm staying, thank you very much. And in due course, George and Tony appeared at the far side of the square. And just as they were turning to go up into the entrance to the grand staircase, George sort of went round like this and went like that. And I thought, I looked around, I thought, it must be maybe something else, but I couldn't see anybody else. There was nobody at the window or anything. And that evening I ran into Tony Blair he had a very good sense of humour. I ran into Tony Blair in the House of Commons. He said, I saw you this morning in the Foreign Office, he said. I told George you were one of his greatest fans.
Please.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency. My name is Mullin Dagu.
You have to speak up a bit,
Okay,
sir.
thank you, Your Excellency. My name is Mullin Dagu, and I'm an Ethiopian. I came from Ethiopia. I'm a journalist by profession, and I came to the United Kingdom winning the Chevening scholarship.
Could you hold it a bit closer, please? People can't hear you. Yes, closer.
I came to the UK winning the
Chevening
Chevening
scholarship,
scholarship in 2015. And my question to you now is, how do you view the current social, economic, and political history of East Africa in general, and Ethiopia in particular? Thank you very much.
Right, well, that's quite a big question for a short answer, isn't it? Well, actually, in my day, Ethiopia was one of the countries we had a very good relationship with. Mr. Meles was the Prime Minister. I know it's quite an authoritarian government. I spent a lot of time trying to persuade him to make peace with Eritrea. Very difficult, because Eritrea is quite a big problem. He always said, oh, he'd get into too much trouble with his party, because that's where they came from, wasn't it, Eritrea? If he accepted the compromise that was being suggested, and I said, we think we think you're clever enough to be able to deal with your party. He said, oh, you don't know the half of it. And I think he proved to be right, given what's happened subsequently. Terrible civil war breaking out. Started in Eritrea, but I know both sides have behaved extremely badly. It's a great disappointment to me, because Ethiopia was well on the way to becoming and perhaps it will do again, a substantial power and a force for good in East Africa. It's one of the great disappointments. I only dealt with Africa for 2 years, but I did go there a lot. And I met many of the movers and shakers. And you go 2 or 3 steps forward and then back again, and all these presidents turn into presidents for life. I was once in, it didn't, I was once in Addis, it was Addis, yes, the African Union Conference. And Kofi Annan was addressing them. And all the rulers of Africa were in the front 2 or 3 rows. And as you know, some of them have been there a very long time. Bongo of Gabon, 45 years. Ayadima, 38 years. The man from Cameroon's been in the presidential palace. He's still there now since 1978, and so on. Kofi Annan said, and he was looking directly at them, he said, one of the tests of leadership is knowing when to stand down. And these guys were looking very stony-faced in the front, but behind an enormous cheers and clapping broke out. And President Chizano of Mozambique, who was in the chair, and who was one of the few who left when his time was up, 2 terms, when Kofi sat down, he pointed at them and he said, and we all know who Kofi was talking about, don't we? Another great cheer. It was an electric moment, but I mean, it's one of the curses of Africa, that these guys, often they're quite good. They get elected amid great hope, on a constitution that says 2 terms and then you retire. And then up towards the middle of their second term, their mates in the parliament are busy trying to push through a constitutional amendment that enables them to run again. And before you know it, you've got a president for life. And if you've got a president for life, they can only be removed by force.
What is your comment? What is your short comment on the current Prime Minister?
Could you repeat the question, please?
Yes, what is my comment on the current Ethiopian Prime Minister, Abiy? Yes, are you going to report back to him what I say? I think he's been a disappointment. I thought it was a big mistake. I mean, he did the right thing to come to terms with Eritrea, I thought, and that seemed very hopeful. I thought it was a bit premature to award him the Nobel Peace Prize. The Nobel Peace Prize has a habit of going to people who go on to disappoint us in a big way. Kissinger got it, for example.
The end of satire. Yes, the question over here, please. Yes.
A different subject. Hello, Chris. I heard you ask a question at the Reith Lecture in Sunderland last week
right, yes,
about the future of democracy. And I just wondered, given your experience and your reference to English nationalism here, what you thought would happen in the next 10 years. So not looking back, but looking forward.
In the next 10 years?
In the next 10 years.
Well, I think what's driving politics to the right across Europe, it's not just here, it is migration, uncontrolled or uncontrollable migration. And I know there's many people on the left who don't want to hear this. But look what's happening. The Austrian president, I think, got overturned on the issue of migration. The Dutch government, now this dreadful man, Geert Wilders, it seems to come out top in Holland, not necessarily prime minister yet, but we'll see. There's very big right-wing neo-fascist parties in Germany, Germany, in Spain, and in France, and they're getting stronger. And much of this is driven by immigration. It's a nearly insoluble problem. I don't claim to have any. There isn't an easy answer to it. As the world outside Fortress Europe disintegrates, so more and more people are on the move. The potential out of Africa is enormous, and it does have to be addressed. And I'm afraid we have to get fairly tough over it because there are many rackets surrounding immigration. People on the left often don't wish to hear this, but if you've been a member of Parliament dealing on one-to-one basis with many of these cases, you get to know about them. I mean, and think of many people, the racketeers have convinced many people who are not remotely facing persecution that a golden life awaits them if they can only make it into Europe. And of course, it doesn't. They can show them videos, of course, about our life, and our life is much better than theirs, usually. But if you don't speak the language, or you've not got the education or the cultural background, you end up working in a nail bar, or in the case of some of those young Vietnamese, a cannabis farm. How do they think they were going to survive here? They don't speak a word of English. The racketeers are the ones who never get caught, who are running the cannabis farms. And then you get tragedies like all those young Vietnamese in the back of a lorry. They weren't fleeing persecution. My wife's Vietnamese. I know Vietnam very well. They were hoping, they were young people who'd scraped together enormous sums of money, incidentally. The racketeers charge a lot of money. And were in the belief that another world awaited them, and of course it didn't.
Your view of the Rwanda policy?
It's of no relevance to the problem, really. Rwanda is a very efficiently run state, but it is a very authoritarian one. I think it's been influenced by the fact that the Australians, who were very ruthless, but had moved all the migrants who were coming by the shipload, to Australia from Afghanistan, Pakistan. They moved them, if you remember, onto some island, remote territory. And of course, it did stop. They did stop the flow. I mean, these people had to endure several years there, and I don't know what's happened now. Many of them will have gone home.
It did stop then.
but it did stop it. And I'm sure that was in the... We don't have remote islands where that could happen, but I'm sure that was the thinking behind the Rwanda policy.
Absolutely. Question here, please.
Hi, Chris. You mentioned the drift right in America and Europe. Is this working?
Yes.
I was just wondering what your advice would be, given Keir Starmer's statements speaking out against union activists, environmental activists, labour activists, peace activists, and all sorts of fairly right-wing rhetoric. What advice would you give to citizens who want to keep Labour or their politics left-wing?
Well, I think we have a very simple choice at the next election. I know you can either have another Conservative government with what all of that implies, or just about all Labour governments are better than Conservative governments. So I obviously you might expect me to say that, but with all their flaws, they are. Some people of Lib Dems go around saying we need a different electoral system. Well, we had a chance of that and we rejected it overwhelmingly. It might not... you remember what happened at the referendum that David Cameron organised, and that was on... the proposal on the table was about, what do you call it?
Alternative vote.
Alternative vote, yes. Well, the Tories, who have a very clear understanding of their interests, were wholly opposed to it. Labour was split down the middle, no surprise there, and the Lib Dems went around saying it wasn't pure enough for them. So we're not entitled to be surprised that that would have been a big step forward. It would enable you to vote honestly. If you wanted to vote for a Green without the risk of letting in a Conservative, you could have voted for a Green and your vote would count, and you put down Labour as second or third choice, and eventually, so your vote would count. It would work both ways, of course. If you a supporter of Reform or UKIP, you could vote UKIP or Reform if you put Conservative second or third. And so you wouldn't end up with the opposite to the result that you really wanted. But it would have been much different, and would have meant that every candidate had to get the endorsement of 50% of the electorate. So I was in favour of that. I'm not in favour of PR. I understand why the small parties are in favour of it, because the tail wags the dog then. The most extreme example is, of course, Israel, where a handful of extremists basically control the government. So my advice to you, as far as the next election is concerned, if it's of any interest, is to grit your teeth and see how you can get rid of, well, I don't know where you live, but grit your teeth and vote for someone who is never going to be what you and perhaps I would want. But we can't make any progress until the current management, I think, are off the scene, and I hope they'll be off the scene for a long time. Given the mess they've made, it'll take a long time to clear up. It won't be spectacular. The other thing you've got to realise is not everybody's as enlightened as you and me. A chap in the House of Lords once said to me, he's a fairly grand figure now, but he came from a very modest background, and he said to me, Chris, what young left-wingers like you don't realise is that the working class on race, on nuclear weapons, on patriotism, are really very right-wing. It's just that they happen to vote Labour. Well, that was the case, of course, until 2019, and maybe it won't be again. But it's something that people on the left of politics often forget. You can't form a government in a country like ours where you've got majority affluence. Most people are relatively affluent in this country. So you can't do it by just mobilising the poor and the disaffected. Because A, because lots of them don't vote anyway, and B, because there aren't enough of them. So you've got to take with you a swathe of the middle ground, and that's always... only a political leader who can do that can hope to form a government in a democracy like ours. Now, I wish Sir Keir would be a bit braver than he has been, I really do. But I understand the need to take the middle ground with you, and we neglect that at our peril.
Question in the middle, please.
On the other great issue of the day, Ukraine, I was wondering if you could give us any insights into tendency in sections of the left to blame it all on NATO.
Oh, well, I don't blame it all on NATO. I don't think NATO's entirely innocent in this. You may, if you're a student of this era, you may know this. I think Russia's we all know that Russia is a monstrous tyranny and that Putin is a monster. We know that. I accept that entirely, and I start from that position. But Gorbachev said repeatedly, who was a very great man, has said repeatedly that he, and I think it's our side's confirmed it, that he was repeatedly assured that if they withdrew the Soviet armies from Eastern Europe, they would not be all signed up into NATO. And of course, as soon as the Russians were out the door, they were. And then the next thing you know, that NATO's trying to is approaching the Ukrainians with a view to trying to get them into NATO. Which and of course they're very keen. I understand that they live next door to. But and I think that was a big mistake. And actually, when the East European countries went into NATO, were admitted to NATO, when was it, the mid-1990s, there were a number of very well-informed people around who thought it wasn't a good idea. George Kennan, who was the architect of the Cold War strategy of containment of the communist powers, described it as a fateful decision. And Perry, I can't remember his first name, who was the US Defense Secretary at the time, said he nearly resigned over it because he thought it would end badly, and it has ended badly. And none of that justifies what the Russians are up to, and I hope they're defeated. But NATO is not entirely innocent.
We have a question over here, please.
You live in Northumberland, surrounded by Tory landowners.
Yes.
What do they think of the current state of the Tory parties, possibly in plural?
Oh, I think they recognise the game's up. I mean, they're quite sensible, civilised people, most of them, not all of them. But one of my Tory neighbours, not a landowner, actually said to me that she was complaining to me that all the utilities are now owned by foreigners. And she said, "I suppose you blame Mrs. Thatcher for that?" I said, "Well, actually, I do, yes."
Do we have a last question from the floor? Yes, or two, in fact, yes. Can we have one microphone there, please, and one microphone at the front, please. Vince, yes, just coming in for you, yes.
Yes, you do, because the other people have to hear you, not just me.
Yes. Chris, the first book of yours that I read was Error of Judgment, which had a profound impact on the people who you wrote about. I just wondered, really, in the intervening time that you've spent in politics and in writing, whether you've been asked to take on any other miscarriages of justice or judgment in a similar way.
Well, I did at the time take on other ones, not in a similar way. I mean, this, for those of you who don't know, is my book about the Birmingham pub bombings, which led to the conviction of the wrong people, and eventually it led actually to the unconviction of those people. And I did take up other cases then, the Guildford case, the Judith Ward case. There were I mean, it's incredible now when we look back, but the police and the criminal justice system got the wrong people for all the big IRA bombings of the mid-1970s. And had we still had the death penalty, 10 out of 18 would have hanged. And in the end, of course, they all had to be released and compensated. But by God, what a struggle it was, because the establishment was very determined not to own up. So yes, that was a big event, the release of the Birmingham Six. And yes, I had hundreds of letters from people claiming to be victims of miscarriage of justice. And I was the MP for Sunderland South. I wasn't in a position to spend my... what I campaigned for, and it succeeded, was the setting up of a Criminal Cases Review Commission to examine alleged miscarriages of justice. And there was a Royal Commission came out of the release of the Birmingham Six, and the CRC was set up as a result of that. And that has quashed since another 500 convictions. There are criticisms of it, but they're presently dealing with those cases of the postmasters who've clearly been framed by the post office. That's outrageous. There's a lot of those cases. But I still do occasionally get people asking me to take up. I can't take up those cases. I'm a retired old gentleman now, and I have no influence. Nobody would reply to my letters if I sent them to government ministers or. And anyway, in the Birmingham case, it came to an end because I found the bombers, and the bombers were all alive and well, of course, in Ireland. But that's what you had to do. I realised you could go on till the cows came home, coming up with new evidence, and we did. We made 3 television documentaries. But unless you could state, that would only prove the case against these guys was weak. Unless you could state with confidence that the people who'd done it were alive and well and living in Ireland, which I was able to do eventually, because I tracked down all 4 of them, and 2 of the 4 owned up to me, and there was plenty of evidence against the others. So because I was able to do that, that gave me the confidence to go on, really.
But you were at the Old Bailey quite recently, weren't you, fulfilling the most sacrosanct of journalistic duties of not revealing your sources?
Yes. When the 6 were released, obviously the question arose, who did do it? And the authorities weren't very interested in that question, because that would involve having to go back into how these wrong people got convicted in the first place. So for a long time, the West Midlands police, who were probably the least qualified force in the country to investigate this aspect, they paddled around a bit, but they didn't really get anywhere. But then there was a very vociferous campaign by relatives of victims, and they forced another inquest, and they gave the West Midlands police a very hard time over their lackadaisical approach to this. But they forced another inquest. They did it. I mean, everybody knows how they died, and that was the job of the inquest. And they were hoping, and it did turn out that way, that it would focus more on who got away. Well, of the 4 people directly responsible for the bombings, 3 I can name, 2 because they're dead, and 1 because he never confided in me, and he's living openly in Dublin now. But the 4th name of the young planter, who was 19 years old at the time, I only got him to talk by guaranteeing, as you often have to do in investigative journalism, that I would not disclose his name. And the police weren't that interested for 30 years in finding out who done it. But suddenly, as a result of this inquest and the campaign by the relatives, the chief constable of the West Midlands thought it would be a good idea to get them off his back and onto mine. And so he took advice. He had tried twice before, and the Director of Public Prosecutions had told him I couldn't be prosecuted. But then they found the 2000 Terrorism Act, which did sort of widen the criteria a bit. And so he served me with an order under the 2000 Terrorism Act. So I appeared at the Old Bailey, not as a criminal. It was a civil action before the Chief Judge at the Old Bailey. And the right of journalists to protect their... It was quite an important case. The NUJ backed me. The right of journalists to protect their sources is fundamental in a democracy, of course. And the judge upheld my case. So that's the end of that. At least I hope it is. The ripples keep... It never quite goes away. The ripples keep drifting outwards. There's a new updated version of... Next year's the 50th anniversary of the Birmingham bombings, and there's an updated version of Error of Judgment coming out in February. So if you're interested, that's something to look out for.
If the young planter were to predecease you, would you reveal
Yes.
the name then?
Yes, but he's younger than me, so I don't think he will.
When you were in London, the abuse you received on social media, your relationship with social media is at an arm's length, but the vitriol that you received from the families, it must be quite hard to bear.
Well, well, from the families, yes. I mean, there's only 1 or 2 of them actually, not. But that's no. A lot of them were the same sort of people. Well, there's a football club, football group big tattooed men. They had photographs on there, but they were shaven-headed. Some ex-policemen and ex-military, I think. I got a lot of abuse from them.
Yeah.
And they, obviously unfamiliar with the case, because they didn't seem to understand that the only reason that 3 of the 4 names are known is as a result of my investigations. They used to say, you know, he's worse than Mullin's worse than the bombers, and he's sheltering the... but they obviously hadn't even acquainted themselves with an outline of the case. So abuse doesn't really worry me. I did get assaulted mildly when I went to the inquest in Birmingham. I had protection there for my visit to the inquest. But comes with the territory.
Indeed. Last question here, please.
Yes, I see you standing against some precious stones there. And my mild dyslexia is getting worse because I read that as he will join Alan Clark in the Parthenon.
In the what?
And I just wonder what a future Chris Mullin diary will say about what happened to the Elgin marbles, if we have.
I see, right, okay. He will join Alan Clark in the pantheon of truly great diarists. I rather like that quote. I'm quite happy to stick with that.
So what will happen to them? How will you record them in a future Chris Mullin diary?
Well, I don't know whether there'll be a market. If there's a market for them, probably just before I die, when I'm about 85, there might be another enough to make another volume, rather slimmer than that one there. But I don't know. I mean, there might not be any interest. We'll just have to see. I've got a great quote for the paperback, incidentally. We'll go on the front in place of that. The greatest diarist of the century, and it's Lord Jay, who is the head of the diplomatic service. I think we'll stick that one on the front next. But whisper this quietly, there haven't been that many diarists in this century yet. So it's not...
Tony Benn's got narrower and narrower, didn't they, towards the end? So there's still scope for a smaller volume.
Oh, well, but he, of course, was a bigger figure than I was. So, I mean, he published, I don't know, 9 volumes altogether, one sort or another. Shall we end on a light note? I know we... just before I retired, I wandered into the central lobby in Parliament, and a man came up to me and he said, I just want to thank you for all the time you spent with us yesterday. And he rabbited on like this for a minute or two. And I realised I didn't know him from Adam, and I said, who do you think I am? He said, Norman Tebbit.
A doppelganger, that can't beat my conclusion. So we'll end on that point and see you outside at the book signing. Thank you very much, Chris Mullin.